In the spring of 1897, a family of 4 walked into a forest in northern Vermont. Only 3 came back. The 4th was never seen again. No body, no note, no explanation, just silence. The case file sits in the basement of the Caledonia County Historical Society, labeled in faded ink. Disappearance of Margaret Ashford, May 14, 1897. Status: unresolved. The paper is yellowed, brittle at the edges. Some pages are water-stained, others are missing entirely. What remains tells a story that refuses to end. Margaret Ashford was 17 years old. Brown hair, gray eyes, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall. She weighed around 110 pounds. She wore a white cotton dress that day, with a blue ribbon tied at the waist. Her boots were hand-stitched leather, worn but well kept. She carried nothing with her, no bag, no coat, no provisions. According to her younger brother, she had been humming a hymn as they walked. The Ashford family lived 3 miles outside the town of Hardwick, Vermont, in a modest farmhouse built by Margaret's grandfather in 1868. The property bordered a dense stretch of woodland known locally as the Silent Grove, a name that predated the family's arrival. No one remembers why it was called that. Some say the trees grew so thick that birdsong barely reached the ground. Others claim it was simply too far from town to hear the church bells. Thomas Ashford, Margaret's father, was 42 years old. A carpenter by trade, he was known for his quietness, his steady hands, and his rigid sense of order. Neighbors described him as a man who spoke only when necessary. His wife, Eleanor, was 39. She managed the household, raised chickens, kept a small vegetable garden, and taught her children to read from the family Bible. She was, by all accounts, a woman of routine and faith. Margaret was the eldest of 3 children. Her brother Samuel was 14. Her sister Ruth was 11. Samuel worked alongside his father. Ruth helped her mother with chores. Margaret, according to town records, had recently begun working as a seamstress for a general store in Hardwick. She walked the 3 miles into town twice a week. She was paid in cash and goods. She never missed a day. The morning of May 14, 1897 was unremarkable. The sky was clear. The temperature hovered around 60 degrees. There had been no rain for 5 days. The ground was dry, the air still. Eleanor Ashford prepared breakfast at dawn. Oatmeal, bread, butter, and milk from the cow. The family ate together as they did every morning. Thomas said a short prayer. Margaret cleared the dishes. Samuel fed the animals. Ruth swept the floor. At approximately 9 o'clock, Thomas announced that he and the children would walk into the forest to gather firewood. Eleanor stayed behind to finish the laundry. This was not unusual. The family made the trip every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the season. They knew the trails. They knew the landmarks. They had done this dozens of times before. They left the house together. Thomas carried an axe. Samuel carried a canvas sack. Margaret and Ruth walked side by side, talking quietly. Eleanor watched them from the porch. She waved. Margaret waved back. That was the last time Eleanor Ashford saw her eldest daughter. The walk into the forest took approximately 20 minutes. The trail was wide at first, then narrowed as the trees closed in. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in pale, shifting beams. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. Samuel later recalled hearing a crow call somewhere to the east. Ruth remembered stepping over a fallen log covered in moss. Margaret, according to both siblings, seemed calm. She did not complain. She did not lag behind. She walked with her hands clasped in front of her, occasionally glancing up at the treetops. She did not speak much, but that was not unusual. Margaret was often quiet. They reached the clearing where Thomas intended to cut wood. It was a familiar spot, a flat area roughly 30 yards across, surrounded by young birch trees. A stream ran along the southern edge, shallow and clear. Thomas set down his axe. Samuel dropped the sack. Ruth sat on a stump to rest. Margaret stood near the edge of the clearing, looking into the trees. Thomas began marking the trees he wanted to cut. Samuel helped him measure. Ruth picked wildflowers near the stream. Margaret remained where she was, standing motionless, her back to the others. And then, according to every account given afterward, she turned and said something. Samuel could not remember the exact words. Ruth claimed she said, "I'll be right back." Thomas insisted she said nothing at all. What is certain is this: Margaret walked into the trees. She did not run. She did not stumble. She simply walked, slowly, deliberately, as if she had heard something, or seen something, or remembered something. Thomas called after her. She did not answer. Samuel ran to the spot where she had disappeared. He called her name. No response. He stepped into the undergrowth, pushing aside branches, scanning the shadows. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. Thomas followed. Then Ruth. All three of them shouted Margaret's name into the silent woods. The forest gave back only their own voices. They searched for 2 hours. They walked in widening circles. They checked every direction. They found no footprints, no broken branches, no sign of struggle, no sign of movement. The ground was dry. The leaves were undisturbed. It was as if Margaret had simply vanished. By noon, Thomas made the decision to return home and alert the neighbors. They walked back in silence. Ruth was crying. Samuel's hands were shaking. Thomas stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. Eleanor met them at the door. She knew immediately. "Where is Margaret?" Thomas could not answer. By that evening, 20 men from Hardwick had gathered at the Ashford farm. They carried lanterns, axes, ropes, and dogs. They organized into search parties. They entered the silent grove at dusk and did not leave until dawn. They found nothing. The next day, 50 more men arrived. Then 70. Then nearly 100. They combed every inch of the forest for a week. They dragged the stream. They searched abandoned cabins. They questioned travelers on the road. They posted notices in neighboring towns. No one had seen Margaret Ashford. No one had heard anything. No one knew anything. And then on the 8th day, something was found. A single blue ribbon, tied around the low branch of a birch tree, roughly half a mile north of the clearing. It was Margaret's ribbon. Eleanor confirmed it. The fabric matched. The knot was identical to the one Margaret had tied that morning. But here is what made no sense. The ribbon was clean, unstained, unworn, as if it had been placed there carefully, deliberately, recently. And beneath the tree, pressed into the soft earth, was a single handprint, small, delicate, feminine, facing away from the clearing, facing deeper into the woods. To understand what happened in that forest, you have to understand who Margaret Ashford was. Not the girl in the missing person report. Not the name in the church registry. The real Margaret. The one her family knew. The one they tried to protect. The one they may have misunderstood. Margaret was born on November 2nd, 1879, in the same farmhouse where she would spend the first 17 years of her life. She was delivered by a midwife named Clara Dunn, who noted in her personal journal that the baby was quiet as snow. She did not cry for nearly a full minute after birth. Eleanor had been terrified. But then Margaret opened her eyes, blinked once and let out a soft, almost reluctant sound. Clara wrote, "A strange child, watchful." As a girl, Margaret was described by neighbors as pleasant but distant. She played with her younger siblings, but often wandered off alone. She was fond of animals, particularly birds. She would sit in the yard for hours, watching sparrows and finches, whispering to them in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. Once when she was 9, a neighbor found her standing in the middle of a field, perfectly still, with a wild rabbit sitting at her feet. When asked what she was doing, Margaret simply said, "Listening." She learned to read early. Her mother taught her using the family Bible, but Margaret quickly grew bored with scripture. She preferred stories, folk tales, legends, accounts of faraway places. The town library had only 12 books, but Margaret read each of them at least twice. Her favorite was a collection of Norse myths, donated by a schoolteacher who had moved to Vermont from Massachusetts. Margaret copied passages into a small notebook, which she kept hidden beneath her mattress. Her father did not approve. Thomas Ashford believed in work, prayer, and discipline. He did not believe in idleness. He did not believe in dreams. When he found the notebook, he burned it in the fireplace. Margaret did not cry. She simply watched the pages curl and blacken. She never kept another notebook, but she did not stop thinking. By the time she turned 15, Margaret had become what the townspeople called dependable. She completed her chores without complaint. She attended church every Sunday. She spoke politely to adults and smiled when expected. She was, by all appearances, a model daughter. But there were moments, small, strange moments, that hinted at something else. In the winter of 1895, Margaret began walking to the edge of the property at night. Not far, just to the tree line. She would stand there for 10, sometimes 20 minutes, staring into the dark. When her mother asked what she was doing, Margaret said, "I thought I heard something." Eleanor dismissed it. Samuel teased her. Ruth ignored it. But it happened again and again, always at night, always alone. In the spring of 1896, a traveling preacher came through Hardwick. He held a revival meeting in the town square. Margaret attended with her family. During the sermon, the preacher spoke of angels, demons, and the voice of God. He said that some people were chosen to hear divine messages, that some were called to leave everything behind and follow a higher purpose. Margaret sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the preacher. After the service, Eleanor asked her what she thought. Margaret said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly she said, "Do you think some people hear things that aren't meant for everyone else?" Eleanor laughed. "That's called imagination, sweetheart." Margaret did not laugh. In the months that followed, Margaret's behavior became subtly different. Not alarming, not worrying, just different. She began waking earlier than usual, before dawn. She would dress in silence, leave the house, and walk to the same spot at the edge of the forest. She would stand there until the sun came up. When asked why, she said she liked the quiet. She stopped singing hymns during chores. She had always hummed while working. It was something her mother had taught her. But now, she worked in silence. She stopped attending the town socials. There were not many, perhaps 4 or 5 a year, but Margaret had always gone. She was polite if not outgoing. But in early 1897, she began declining invitations. She said she was tired, that she preferred to stay home. Her mother worried that she was lonely, that she needed friends her own age. But Margaret insisted she was fine. And in truth, she did seem fine. She was not sad. She was not angry. She was simply elsewhere. One evening in late April, less than 3 weeks before the disappearance, Samuel found Margaret standing in the barn. She was facing the open door, looking out at the forest. The sun had just set. The sky was bruised purple. Samuel asked what she was looking at. Margaret did not turn around. "Do you ever feel like something's waiting for you?" she said. Samuel laughed. "Waiting for me? Like what? Supper?" Margaret shook her head. "No, I mean, like something you're supposed to do, or go to, or become." Samuel didn't know what to say. Margaret finally turned to look at him. Her expression was calm, almost serene. "Never mind," she said. "I'm just being silly." But Samuel remembered that moment, because Margaret almost never talked like that. And because when he thought about it later, he realized something. She hadn't looked confused. She had looked certain. On the morning of May 14th, Margaret woke before anyone else. She dressed quietly, braided her hair, and tied the blue ribbon around her waist. She stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the forest. Ruth woke and asked what she was doing. Margaret smiled. "Just thinking." "About what?" Margaret hesitated. Then she said softly, "About whether it's wrong to want something no one else understands." Ruth, still half asleep, shrugged. "I don't know, is it?" Margaret didn't answer. At breakfast, Eleanor noticed that Margaret ate very little. When asked if she felt ill, Margaret said she was fine, just not hungry. Thomas announced the plan to gather firewood. Margaret stood immediately, as if she had been waiting. Eleanor asked if she wanted to stay home and rest. Margaret shook her head. "I'd like to go," she said. And so she did. The walk to the forest was quiet. Samuel talked about a plow that needed fixing. Ruth complained about her shoes pinching. Thomas said nothing. Margaret walked with her hands clasped, her gaze distant. At one point, Ruth asked her a question. Margaret didn't respond. Ruth repeated it. Margaret blinked as if waking from a dream. "Sorry, What? I asked if you think we'll see any deer. Margaret looked toward the trees. Maybe. Do you think they're scared of us? Margaret thought about it. Then she said, I think they know when someone's coming, and I think they know when someone's leaving. Ruth didn't understand. Margaret didn't explain. When they reached the clearing, Margaret stood at the edge longer than usual. She stared into the forest with an intensity that made Samuel uneasy. He almost said something, but then Thomas called him over and the moment passed. And then Margaret spoke, or didn't speak, or said something no one could quite remember, and walked into the trees. Not running, not stumbling, just walking, like she had been invited. There are moments in history that refuse to stay buried, moments that echo across decades, preserved not in photographs or letters, but in the silence of those who were there. May 14th, 1897, was such a moment, and what happened in that clearing, or didn't happen, has never been fully explained. The search began within hours, but the real investigation didn't start until 3 days later, when Sheriff William Carver arrived from St. Johnsbury with 2 deputies and a stenographer. Carver was 56 years old, a former railroad detective with a reputation for thoroughness. He did not believe in ghosts. He did not believe in coincidences. He believed in evidence. He found almost none. The first official interview was conducted on May 17th in the Ashford home. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his hands flat against the wood. Eleanor stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder. Samuel and Ruth waited in the next room. Carver asked Thomas to describe in precise detail everything that happened in the clearing. Thomas spoke slowly. His voice was steady, but his jaw trembled. We reached the spot around 9:30, maybe 9:40. The sun was high, warm, no wind. The clearing was empty, just us. And Margaret? She stood near the trees, to the west, maybe 10 yards from where I was working. Was she facing you? Thomas paused. No, she was facing the forest. For how long? I don't know, a few minutes, maybe longer. I was marking trees. Did she say anything? Thomas closed his eyes. I don't remember. Carver leaned forward. Mr. Ashford, this is important. Did your daughter speak before she walked away? Thomas looked at Eleanor. She said nothing. I think she said she'd be right back, but I'm not sure. I wasn't paying attention. Why not? Thomas stiffened. Because we were working. Because I didn't think... He stopped. His voice cracked. I didn't think I needed to. Carver nodded and moved on. Samuel was interviewed next. He was more detailed, but also more uncertain. He remembered Margaret standing near the edge of the clearing. He remembered her turning slightly, as if listening. He remembered her taking a step forward. Did you see where she went? Carver asked. Samuel shook his head. I wasn't looking. I was helping my father. But when I turned around, she was gone. How long between seeing her and noticing she was gone? Maybe 2 minutes, maybe less. And you heard nothing. No footsteps. No branches breaking. Nothing. Ruth's testimony was shorter. She had been picking flowers near the stream, her back to the clearing. She heard Samuel call Margaret's name. When she turned, Margaret was already gone. Did your sister seem upset that morning? Carver asked. Ruth frowned. No, she seemed normal. Normal how? Ruth hesitated. Quiet, like always. Did she say anything strange? Anything unusual? Ruth thought for a long moment, then she said, the night before, she told me she had a dream. Carver straightened. What kind of dream? She said she dreamed she was walking through the forest, and someone was calling her name. But when she turned around, no one was there. Did she say who was calling her? Ruth shook her head. She said she didn't recognize the voice, but she said it felt like someone she was supposed to meet. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Thomas stared at the table. Carver wrote it down. The physical search continued for another week. Over 120 men combed the forest in organized grids. They used dogs, 3 hunting hounds borrowed from a nearby estate. The dogs picked up Margaret's scent near the clearing, followed it west for approximately 200 yards, then stopped abruptly near a cluster of white pines. They circled, whined, refused to go further. The handlers tried again. Same result. One of the handlers, a man named Joseph Leland, later told the local newspaper, I've been training dogs for 30 years. I've never seen them act like that. It wasn't fear, it was confusion, like the trail just ended. On May 22nd, the ribbon was found. It was tied loosely around a low-hanging branch, roughly half a mile north of the clearing. The fabric was clean, unstained, and showed no signs of weathering. Beneath the tree, pressed into a patch of soft, damp earth, was a handprint. Carver measured it, 5 inches from wrist to fingertip, narrow, delicate, consistent with Margaret's size. But the positioning bothered him. The handprint was not smudged. It was not partial. It was complete, pressed flat, as if Margaret had knelt down carefully and placed her hand there with intention, and it was facing away from the clearing, toward the deeper woods. Carver stood in that spot for nearly an hour, studying the ground, the trees, the angles of light. He tried to reconstruct what might have happened. Had Margaret run? No. There were no other footprints, no disturbance in the undergrowth. Had she been dragged? No. The ground showed no signs of struggle. Had she been carried? Unlikely. A person carrying a body would leave deeper impressions. Broken branches. Something. So what then? Carver walked the half-mile back to the clearing, counting his steps, studying the terrain. The route was not direct. It wound between trees, over roots, around natural obstacles. It was not the kind of path someone would take in a hurry, or in distress. It was the kind of path someone would take if they were being careful, or if they were following something. On May 24th, Carver interviewed the neighbors. Most had nothing to add, but one, an elderly woman named Ada Pruitt, who lived 2 miles south of the Ashford farm, recalled seeing Margaret 3 weeks earlier. She was walking along the road, Ada said, alone. It was late afternoon. I asked where she was going. She said she was just walking. But she wasn't heading toward town. She was heading toward the forest. Did she seem distressed? No, she seemed calm, almost happy. Carver also spoke with Margaret's employer, a man named Henry Dalton, who ran the general store in Hardwick. Dalton described Margaret as reliable, quiet, and competent, but he mentioned something odd. About a month ago, she asked me if I'd ever heard stories about the Silent Grove. Carver leaned forward. What kind of stories? Old ones. Settler stories. About people who went into the woods and didn't come back. I told her they were just tales. Nonsense. She nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. Did she say why she was asking? Dalton shook his head. No, but she looked, I don't know, curious, like she was trying to figure something out. By the end of May, the searches were scaled back. By mid-June, they stopped entirely. Sheriff Carver filed his final report on June 18, 1897. His conclusion: no evidence of foul play, no evidence of accident, no evidence of voluntary departure, status unresolved. But in his personal notes, found years later in a storage box in the county courthouse, Carver wrote something else. I do not believe Margaret Ashford was taken. I believe she went willingly, but where and why I cannot say. The forest holds no answers, only questions. On the evening of June 20th, Thomas Ashford returned to the clearing alone. He carried a lantern, an axe, and a Bible. He walked to the spot where Margaret had last been seen. He stood there for a long time, staring into the trees. Then he did something he would never speak of again. He called her name, once, twice, 3 times. The forest gave back only silence. And then, according to a farmer who happened to be passing nearby, Thomas fell to his knees and wept. Not quietly, not with restraint, but like a man who had lost something he would never understand. A disappearance doesn't end when the search stops. It lives on in the people left behind, in the questions they ask themselves, in the silence at the dinner table, in the way they avoid looking at empty chairs. The Ashford family never recovered, but they did learn to survive, and in surviving, they uncovered something they wished they hadn't. By the summer of 1897, the town of Hardwick had moved on, not cruelly, not callously, but life continued. Harvests came, seasons changed. People spoke of Margaret less and less. She became a story, then a rumor, then a name mentioned only in passing. But the Ashfords did not move on. Eleanor stopped attending church. She could not bear the hymns Margaret used to hum. She could not bear the sympathetic glances from neighbors. She spent most of her days in the house, cooking, cleaning, tending to chores with mechanical precision. She did not smile. She did not cry. She simply existed. Thomas returned to work. He took contracts in neighboring towns, sometimes staying away for days at a time. When he was home, he spoke little. He ate in silence. He avoided the west-facing windows. He never went back to the forest. Samuel grew quieter. He had always been a talkative boy, eager and energetic. But after Margaret disappeared, something inside him dimmed. He stopped joking. He stopped asking questions. He worked alongside his father without complaint, but his eyes were distant, haunted. Ruth, the youngest, tried to hold the family together. She cooked when her mother couldn't. She swept the floors. She spoke cheerfully, even when no one responded. But at night, alone in the room she had once shared with Margaret, she would lie awake and stare at the empty bed across from hers. She never moved into it. She never touched Margaret's belongings. She left everything exactly as it was. In late August, Eleanor found something. She had been cleaning Margaret's room, something she did compulsively, as if keeping it perfect might somehow bring her daughter back. She was smoothing the quilt when her hand brushed against something hard beneath the mattress. She pulled it out. It was a small wooden box, no larger than a Bible, with a simple brass latch. Eleanor had never seen it before. She opened it carefully. Inside were 3 items. The first was a pressed flower, a white trillium, common in the Vermont woods. It had been carefully preserved between 2 sheets of parchment. The second was a scrap of paper, torn from a larger page. On it, in Margaret's handwriting, were 4 words, "When the time comes." The third item made Eleanor's breath catch. It was a lock of hair, not Margaret's. The color was wrong, darker, almost black, and it was tied with a thin piece of twine, knotted in a way Eleanor didn't recognize. She showed it to Thomas that evening. He stared at it for a long time, then closed the box and handed it back. "Burn it," he said. "Thomas, burn it, Eleanor. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter now." But Eleanor didn't burn it. She hid it in the bottom of her wardrobe, where it would remain for the rest of her life. In September, a traveling peddler passed through Hardwick. His name was Marcus Yeller, a French-Canadian man who sold tools, fabrics, and sundries from a wagon. He had been through the area before. He knew the Ashford family. When he heard about Margaret's disappearance, he went to the farm. Thomas met him at the door. They spoke briefly. Then Yeller said something that made Thomas go pale. "I saw her,"